Happy to have you here. I took a week's vacation earlier this summer, long planned. I took some days at the end of July. Susan and I planned to spend some time at the beach. I was so looking forward to it. And then, of course, just before my vacation days rolled around, naturally, I fell down. I rolled over on my ankle and snapped ligaments. So this meant my beach vacation was now going to be a beach vacation on crutches. And there's nothing more efficient and more fun and more relaxing than crutching around in the sand. What this meant in practice was that I spent what was supposed to be my beach vacation not on the beach because I couldn't get myself there. I instead spent most of my vacation on the couch. Which meant that this was pretty much the view for my beach vacation. A fascinating new Pentagon white paper that I read on my time off. It's called Russian Strategic Intentions, a Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment. Yeah. Happy vacation, honey. This is how I know Susan loves me. She's like, no, hon, it's okay. I'll walk the dog. You just read your Pentagon white paper. That's cool. Let me know how it ends. The Washington Post and Time magazine have both, within the past 24 hours, published big news scoops about the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and something that Russia is now doing in his home state. Tom Hamburger is the lead reporter of the Washington Post's piece. He's going to be joining us live in just a moment. But there's something from my vacation, from my cozy couch time with my crutches and the Pentagon's latest strategic multi-year assessment on Russian strategic intentions. There is something from that vacation reading that I did that has been really like pinging like an alarm clock in my head about this new reporting. In this new Pentagon report that I just read, one of the main ideas is that Russia is operating in a sort of gray zone in its efforts to try to get what it wants around the world, but also specifically to get what it wants against us. A mix of military and intelligence and seemingly private operations that are organized by the Kremlin and that are designed to coerce us and to weaken us as an adversary and a rival. Quote, while the United States focused on executing the global war on terror, Russia actively pursued malign influence in all regions of the world to mitigate their inferior conventional capability. Russia has a growing and demonstrated capacity and willingness to exercise malign influence in Europe and abroad, including in the United States. Quote, countering Russian gray zone efforts are not specific to just the U.S. Defense Department, but must be part of a whole of U.S. government effort that leverages all elements of U.S. national power. Russia's gray zone tactics are most effective when the target of those tactics is deeply polarized or lacks the capacity to resist and respond effectively to Russian aggression. Conversely, countries that are resilient against attempts to divide their populace or to apply economic coercion or to wield proxy forces, those entities can better handle sub-conventional threats from Russia, meaning threats from Russia short of actual old-fashioned traditional warfare. And again, this is a Pentagon report. It is unsettling, right, to have the Pentagon saying, you know, when we look around the world, we see Russia using all sorts of underhanded tactics to undermine foreign democracies and to compromise the leadership and values of other countries, to screw them up. But don't worry, there's a cure. Don't worry, America. The only entities, the only countries that really will have any sort of significant problem fending that off from Russia are countries that are deeply polarized. Oh, good, so we don't have to worry about that. Also, the kinds of countries that will have a real problem with this stuff from Russia are those who lack the capacity to respond effectively to Russian aggression. Oh, so that as a leadership factor might sort of be a problem then, if we don't have the capacity to respond to Russian aggression. I mean, the fact is nobody much expects President Trump himself to respond effectively to Russian aggression, right? Or to do anything to push back or contain Russia at all. I mean, one of the undisputed findings of what happened between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election was that Trump welcomed their help in trying to elect him. He welcomed their interference in our election that year because it would redound to him. He's still trying today to muddy the waters as to whether or not Russia really even did anything at all, let alone, worrying about punishing them for it. So nobody expects anything from the president himself in terms of the will to resist, let alone the will to respond, the will to harden us as a target, let alone retaliate against Russia for coming after us. But it's interesting. As worrying as it is, and as unpleasant as it is for us as a country to be so irredeemably polarized in our culture and our politics right now, there actually hasn't been a 100% partisan divide on this issue of Russia coming after us. I mean, yeah, there's a partisan cast to how the two parties have responded. But even in this ramshackle and at times ridiculous U.S. Congress, you have had some Republican support. You have had some bipartisan supported legislation to, for example, up our election security efforts heading into the next presidential election, since the FBI says Russia's definitely going to do the same thing to our 2020 elections that they did to 2016. I mean, not every Republican admits that we need to shore up those defenses, but quite a few of them do. And so there have been actual bipartisan efforts to draft and push good legislation that would change our laws, that would up our capacity as a country to try and stop that in 2020. There's also been some significant bipartisan efforts on sanctions against Russia to retaliate against them for what they did in our election. Sanctions on the individuals in the Russian government, sanctions on Kremlin-connected figures who carried out or supported the 2016 attack. There has been some significant bipartisan support there. And I mean, you know, I don't mean to damn with faint praise here. You ought to be able to expect that, right? Even back in 2016, when the attack was underway, President Obama was willing, as president, to brush back Putin, tell him to cut out what he was doing. But President Obama and his administration thought the better way to shut Putin up, and honestly, to make the American public less susceptible to what Russia was doing, make the American public more resilient against the types of attacks Putin was launching that actually targeted the American people. The Obama administration thought the best way to do that, beyond President Obama doing what he did, was that there should be a whole-of-government response, a bipartisan, bicameral clapback from the United States. That would not just be from the president. It would be from not just the executive branch, not just U.S. intelligence, right? It would be the whole of government. It'd be the whole executive branch, our law enforcement and intelligence capability, and it would also be the whole House and the whole Senate, both parties, unanimously, warning Putin, back off, get out of our elections, or you will face serious consequences. The Obama administration fully expected they could get that from the U.S. Congress when they gave Congress information about what at that point was an ongoing Russian attack on our election. I mean, why wouldn't they think they could get that kind of a patriotic reaction? This was an attack on our country from abroad, from a hostile foreign power. That is the sort of thing that, if nothing else, that's supposed to bring us together, right? It didn't happen, though, for one very specific reason. Famously, that request from President Obama for a bipartisan punchback against Putin when he was attacking the 2016 campaign, that request was blocked by one man, one Republican, Kentucky Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate and still today. McConnell said he wasn't sure if he believed the Russians were really doing what they were doing. And besides, basically implied, what's the big deal? So thanks to Mitch McConnell blocking what would have otherwise been a whole-of-government response against Russia during the campaign in the middle of their attack, that clapback from the U.S. government didn't happen. Also, those bipartisan bills I just mentioned, the ones that are up right now that would protect the 2020 election from the same kind of Russian attack we had in 2016, those bills do have bipartisan support. They do have bipartisan sponsors, but they too are being blocked by one man in Washington, one Republican, Senator Mitch McConnell, who will not let any of those bills come up for a vote, even though they are bipartisan sponsored and they have bipartisan support. Also, frankly, those sanctions against Russia for what they did in the election, there was a lot of Republican support for sanctions against Russia in response to that attack. But once again, it has been one man in Washington who has blocked some of those efforts for, shall we say, reasons of his own. When Russia attacked us, it wasn't just Russian military intelligence. It was also their spy service. It was also Kremlin-connected oligarchs who seemed to have been kind of deputized by the Kremlin to run different parts of that complex operation. It was, for example, Kremlin-connected oligarchs who who were running seemingly private businesses, who during the campaign took it upon themselves to stovepipe Russian-made propaganda to U.S. voters. It was oligarchs running ostensibly private businesses who were creating fake American political groups and organizing and provoking artificial online fights among American voters. They were even organizing real-world U.S. protests in American streets to try to wind up and screw with the American public as much as possible, all to help Trump's campaign for the American presidency as much as they could, while dividing and weakening the American polity as much as they could. One Kremlin-connected oligarch in particular had a whole bunch of odd and strange contacts and connections with the highest reaches of Trump's campaign. In a State Department cable from way back in 2006, which was leaked by WikiLeaks years ago, this oligarch, a guy named Oleg Deripaska, was described as among the 2 or 3 oligarchs Putin turns to on a regular basis. U.S. diplomats described Deripaska's favorable relationship with President Putin. They described him as a more or less permanent fixture, for example, on Putin's trips abroad. The same year as that U.S. diplomatic cable about Deripaska, in 2006, the Associated Press reports that that same oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, as close as he was to the Kremlin, he entered into a strange contract with an American, with the American man who would ultimately become Donald Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. According to a memo written by Manafort proposing this arrangement to Deripaska back in 2005, 2006, Manafort proposed that for the low price of $10 million a year, he would run a campaign to influence politics, business, and news coverage in the United States to benefit the Putin government. Quote, "We are now of the belief that this model can greatly benefit the Putin government if employed at the correct levels with the appropriate commitment to success." And in Manafort's view, the appropriate commitment was reportedly $10 million a year, as specified in the contract. The AP says they saw records of wire transfers of millions and millions of dollars to Paul Manafort in conjunction with that contract, starting that year, 2006, and ending we don't know when. Over the years, Oleg Deripaska and Paul Manafort would have a lot of different political and business engagements together. Manafort, of course, now sits in federal prison. He may ultimately be looking at a long state prison sentence that picks up after his federal sentence. As such, we may never fully know the extent of what was going on in Manafort's overseas career in those intervening years, including his interactions with Deripaska. We do know, though, that by the time Manafort took over as Trump's campaign chair for 2016, for some reason, he saw that gig on the Trump campaign as a good reason and a good occasion to re-up his long-standing relationship with that Kremlin-connected oligarch, with Oleg Deripaska. One of Deripaska's close aides told Time magazine in an interview last year that when Manafort became Trump's campaign chair, quote, "He owed us a lot of money, and he was offering ways to pay it back." We know from the Mueller investigation that for some reason, Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort offered this Russian-connected oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, he offered him private briefings on the Trump campaign during the election, up to and including the still unexplained plotline from Mueller's investigation, in which Manafort is known to have shipped Deripaska a whole bunch of internal Trump campaign polling data, non-public, proprietary information on the campaign's plans and strategy, particularly in key states in the industrial Midwest that Trump would go on to unexpectedly flip on his way to an election night victory in 2016. Why did Deripaska want that kind of granular information? Manafort is known to have passed that data on to Deripaska during the 2016 campaign through an intermediary who has himself now been charged by federal prosecutors. The intermediary that Manafort used to ship this stuff to Deripaska is believed by the FBI to himself be linked to Russian intelligence. So when it comes to what Russia did and how Russia messed with our election, Deripaska is this key figure who is still a bit of a mystery. He definitely plugs into the Manafort part of this scandal in a way that Mueller's report essentially leaves as an open question. This is from Mueller's report, quote, "The special counsel's office could not reliably determine Manafort's purpose in sharing internal polling data during the campaign period. Manafort, something redacted, did not see a downside to sharing campaign information and told Rick Gates that his role in the campaign would be good for business and potentially a way to be made whole for the work he previously completed in Ukraine. As to Deripaska, Manafort claimed that by sharing campaign information with him, Deripaska might see value in their relationship and resolve a disagreement, a reference to one or more outstanding lawsuits. Remember Deripaska's friend saying Manafort owed them a ton of money. So Deripaska is this intriguing figure when it comes to Russia's attack on our election. Deripaska is believed by the U.S. government to not just be highly connected to the Kremlin and to Putin's office in particular. He's believed by the U.S. government to have organized crime links as well. As such, he has long been barred from getting a visa to visit the United States. But Deripaska is doing very well in Russia. He's also the head of a huge Russian aluminum conglomerate. When it came time to sanction Deripaska for his role in Russia's attack on our 2016 election, it made sense that those sanctions wouldn't just apply to him personally, they'd also apply to his business, right, to his firm. Seems like exactly the kind of way you might want to use sanctions if you really wanted them to have an impact on the country you were targeting and the people you most wanted to pinch. But again, if you were going to really go after them where it hurt, you'd want to trust that your own country's leadership was going to stand behind it. You'd want the leader of the U.S. federal government to have, I mean, forgive me, like some stones on the issue, right? I mean, if you're going to take that route. I mean, this is a guy who's very close to Putin and to the Kremlin, linked to supposedly to organized crime. In terms of his business interest, you know what? Russia has a terrible economy. Russia does not make that much stuff at all other than oil and gas, so it's totally dependent on oil and gas prices and its links with Western oil companies for its economic future. But Deripaska does have this big aluminum company, and that's something. His big aluminum company is actually a substantial business interest for the whole country of Russia. Sanctioning that company would take a big bite out of the Russian economy. Sanctioning that company, I mean, that might actually hit them where it hurts. Therefore, perhaps inevitably, with this leadership that we've got right now in our government, the Trump administration decided to go wobbly on the sanctions against Deripaska and his firm. They had second thoughts. They decided just a few months after they had announced the sanctions in the first place that they were going to drop the sanctions on Deripaska's firm. And what was initially a really heartening bipartisan response to that was when Congress sort of revolted against that decision by the Trump administration. All the Democrats in the House and the Senate, 70% of the Republicans in the House, a whole bunch of Republicans in the Senate, they all got up on their hind legs and told the Trump administration, no, are you kidding? You can't drop the sanctions on this guy. You just put them on. Our election was actually attacked by Russia. These sanctions will hit them where it hurts. These sanctions are there for a reason. Why would you drop these sanctions? Congress got mad. There was a huge response against what the Trump administration did. Again, a bipartisan response. Well, thanks to this new reporting out today from Time Magazine and the Washington Post, we now know what happened next. In January of this year, an executive from Deripaska's firm, from his big aluminum company, sat down for dinner with an American entrepreneur. They met at a fancy restaurant in Zurich, Switzerland. The American guy was somebody who'd had a little bit of experience dealing with the Russians and Russian oligarchs in particular. He had previously sold a U.S. steel business to Russian oligarchs. But in January, he was over in Switzerland meeting with a guy from Oleg Deripaska's Russian aluminum company. And the problem, of course, was at that moment, that Russian aluminum company was under U.S. sanctions. Even though the Trump administration had decided to drop those sanctions, they were under U.S. sanctions at that time. It was therefore illegal for any American to do any business with them whatsoever. As first reported in Time Magazine and the Washington Post today, we now know that the day after that dinner in Switzerland is when Mitch McConnell killed the bill in the Senate that would have maintained the sanctions on Oleg Deripaska and his firm. There was bipartisan support for keeping those sanctions in place. There was a good reason to keep those sanctions in place, given what Deripaska did, right? When the Trump administration said they wanted to drop those sanctions, there was a bipartisan revolt in Congress. Congress stood up and said, no, we're not going to let you drop those sanctions. You have to keep them. Until Mitch McConnell stepped in and he allowed for them to be dropped. And now we know that within weeks, that businessman from that Switzerland dinner would announce that Oleg Deripaska's Russian aluminum firm had suddenly dug into the couch cushions and found $200 million that they were now going to invest in a brand new aluminum plant in Mitch McConnell's state, Mitch McConnell's home state of Kentucky. The biggest aluminum plant of its kind built in this country in nearly 40 years. It never could have happened had the sanctions still been in place. Mitch McConnell is the one who made sure those sanctions were dropped, and then Deripaska's firm basically immediately wrote that $200 million check. And so, no, I am not happy that I spent my vacation on crutches and on the couch instead of on the beach. But I am glad that by virtue of the fact that I was laid up, I had the chance to read that new Pentagon white paper on Russia's strategy and how they operate in the gray zone. Because it is, I think, helpful to see this not just from the perspective of, oh my God, what is Mitch McConnell doing? But, oh my God, what has Mitch McConnell done? What is Russia trying to do here that Mitch McConnell has just allowed to happen? I mean, here's that quote again from the section of the Pentagon report that's called Moscow's Gray Zone Toolkit. Quote, hybrid tactics are most effective when the target entity is deeply polarized or lacks the capacity to resist and respond effectively to Russian aggression. Conversely, countries that are resilient against attempts to divide their populace or apply economic coercion or yield proxy forces can better handle subconventional threats from Russia. Countries that are resilient against attempts to apply economic coercion will survive these kinds of attacks from Russia better than countries that are not resilient in that way. Well, in what way can Russia, with its crappy economy and its zero economic future, in what way can Russia ever economically coerce us? I mean, you can understand it in terms of like countries on their border, the former Soviet Union, and that sort of sphere of influence they want to exert, countries where they can use oil and gas to really leverage the economies of those countries in ways that serve the Russian government. Okay, right, got it. But what can Russia do to us to economically coerce us? Well, skip to the end here. Skip to the recommendations of this new Pentagon report. Quote, hybrid tactics are most effective when the target state has lost the will or capacity to resist. The most prevalent indicators or signposts that an entity is vulnerable to Russian hybrid actions include political and social turmoil, weak security structures, and large Russian investments in its key capabilities. The Pentagon is telling us in this report from just a few weeks ago that one of the signs that Russia is making progress in its efforts to undo your country is when you start to see, not just weak security structures, like, say, not taking any actions to harden your elections ahead of a planned Russian attack on your next presidential campaign, or, increased political and social turmoil, not like we know anything about that in this country. Hello, day that ends in Y. Right? But in addition to those things, they're saying the other big thing to watch for here, the other big signpost that Russia is basically softening you up so they can leverage what they want out of you is large Russian investments in key capabilities in your country, by which they mean specifically large economic Russian investments in your country that they can leverage. Quoting from Time Magazine's new reporting on what Mitch McConnell did here, quote, critics of the deal, the Rusal aluminum deal in Kentucky, critics of the deal, both Democratic and Republicans, say it gives Moscow political influence that could undermine national security. Pointing to Moscow's use of economic leverage to sway European politics, they warn this Kentucky deal is a stalking horse for a new kind of Russian meddling in America. Veteran diplomat Daniel Freed, who shaped U.S. policy on Eastern Europe at the State Department from the 1980s until 2017, tells Time, quote, that's just what the Russians do. They insert themselves into a foreign economy and then start to influence its politics from the inside. Heather Conley, who was a senior State Department official under George W. Bush, describes what Rusal is doing here as, quote, a strategy from within. Quote, you cannot go against them in a policy decision, even though it's in our national interest, when they have infiltrated you economically. One Kremlin-connected oligarch, Dmitry Firtash, who's currently fighting extradition to the United States, he told Time in an interview a couple years ago how this sort of strategy works from the perspective of Kremlin-connected oligarchs. He told them, quote, what is a factory in a one-factory town? It's what all life revolves around. We don't just pay wages, we provide the social safety net. So people believe us. Firtash explained that when he and his factories put their support behind a political cause or a political candidate, quote, that influences people. That's what ensures electoral support. So that's why we make sure that we run the factories, especially in one-factory towns. The short story here about Mitch McConnell is that he, more than anybody else in Washington, has blocked U.S. efforts to constrain or respond to Russia's recent attacks. That's why they're calling him Moscow Mitch now, right? But in this particular instance, his state, an economically disadvantaged part of his state, got a $200 million investment from a Kremlin-connected oligarch immediately after McConnell personally stepped in to make sure that sanctions on that oligarch were dropped, despite his role in what happened to our election in 2016 and despite bipartisan support, even from his own party, for those sanctions. But don't just look back at this. Look forward, right? I mean, the FBI says Russia's going to do to our election in 2020 what they did to it in 2016. They're saying it's happening right now. No reason to expect 2020 is going to be any different. If Oleg Deripaska is still one of the 2 or 3 oligarchs who Putin looks to get his work done around the world, and given what we know he did in 2016, should we expect that Deripaska is going to be involved in Russia's 2020 election operations as well? I mean, you have to say the odds of that are better now than they were before Mitch McConnell sold off this corner of his state in this vote. I mean, after all, before McConnell did what he did, Oleg Deripaska might have felt a little worried about participating in any Russian attack on us in 2020, right? He might have worried about those crippling sanctions that the U.S. government put on him, at least for a while, after 2016. I mean, McConnell made sure those were gone, but maybe he'd worry that if he did more in 2020, he would get those sanctions back, or he'd be further sanctioned in his business activities. He might have had to worry about that before Mitch McConnell did what he did. But now, Oleg Deripaska's business activities, the health of his business empire, that's part and parcel of the hardscrabble economy in one of Kentucky's neediest counties. I mean, this is a plant that's over $1 billion, one of the biggest aluminum plants in the U.S. ever. It's 40% owned by the company of this Kremlin-connected oligarch. You're not going to be able to sanction him, no matter what he does to our 2020 election or whatever else he does at all. It would strangle Kentucky in the process. There would be hundreds, if not thousands, of American jobs riding on anything you did to that Russian guy's company, or frankly, anything you did to bother him. He now holds all of those American jobs in his hand. The U.S. government does anything to bother him, he can take them away at will. So you can't do anything to his company, not without him exerting that leverage over Kentucky in response. And that damage has already been done. As the Washington Post reports, as Democrats have been clamoring to review that deal, given all its implications, Rusal is now threatening that if they come under too much scrutiny by the U.S. government, they might just yank all that financing for the plant right now. They might just make sure that plant never even opens. You're going to put all of those American jobs, hundreds, if not thousands of American jobs, at risk just so you can review Oleg's deal? No, Oleg thinks that's a terrible idea. He says you shouldn't do that. I mean, it gives this Kremlin-connected firm and this Kremlin-connected oligarch that kind of leverage in our country already. And in the wake of what Mitch McConnell did for them, this same company run by this Kremlin-connected oligarch who used Mitch McConnell to get his nose under the tent and to rescue himself from punishment for the U.S. election attack and to insulate himself from any threat of future sanctions against him for anything else he might do in the future. That same firm, owned by that same Kremlin-connected oligarch, in the wake of what they have done in Kentucky, this same guy who signed Paul Manafort up to a $10 million a year contract to help the Putin government around the world, including in the United States. That same company where their leader inexplicably getting Trump campaign data during the campaign. That same company, Deripaska's company, has now written to governors in 8 other U.S. states, offering that they'd like to build an aluminum plant in all those places, too, as soon as they're done in Kentucky. I mean, why not? Worked with Mitch McConnell, worked with the Republican who controls the United States Senate. Why not do it all over this country? Imagine what else they could get their leverage on. Stay with us. More ahead.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.